Ukraine President Volodymyr Zelensky went to the United Nations General Assembly today after having gone to the United Nations Security Council meeting yesterday to make the case for why his country needs to force Russia into capitulation. That may sound a little strange given the tactical updates that we give a lot here. And well, it seems kind of strange to us too. So we're trying to maybe get some help from one of the best minds that we know, both militarily and diplomatically. And that, of course, is Colonel Doug Macgregor. Colonel Macgregor, CEO for our country, our choice combat veteran, highly decorated, and just a great all-around guy. Doug, welcome back to the show.
Sure. Happy to be here.
Well, listen, when you even heard what I said out there, when you even see some of the headlines, of course, this isn't surprising. We had been signaled already that Zelensky coming to give his victory plan. Even before we show what he actually said today, what do you think of his, I don't even know, the mindset, that what he's hoping to accomplish by coming up with a victory plan to Washington?
Well, the people that have kept him in power and made him probably close to a billionaire want him to sustain the war at any cost. And that's the decision in Washington, D.C. They can't admit to any disasters or any losses. They have to stay the course. So he's here to deliver the message that he and the 16 remaining fit Ukrainian soldiers are ready to march to the front and give us more long-range strike weapons in the hopes that we can entangle you, the United States of America, into a direct confrontation with Russia.
Well, and that comes close to getting to being bizarre. I think that the United States even has the capacity to fight Russia. More on that in a minute. But first of all, let's take a look at what Zelensky actually said, because he's going to list here what I consider a laundry list of aspirations. It would be cool if this were true. Watch this.
We must restore nuclear safety. Energy must stop being used as a weapon. We must ensure food security. We need to bring home all our captured soldiers and civilians forcibly deported to Russia. We must uphold the UN Charter and guarantee our right, Ukraine's right to territorial integrity and sovereignty, just as we do for any other nation. We need to withdraw the Russian occupiers, which will bring an end to the hostilities in Ukraine, and we must hold those responsible for war crimes accountable. We need to prevent ecocide and stop the destruction of nature caused by the war. And we must not allow a second or third phase of this Russian invasion. And we need to make it clear the war is over. This is the peace formula. What part of this could be unacceptable to anyone who upholds the UN Charter?
If this was like, say, February 25th of 2022, like the war had just started, and he wants to give this, aspirational speech, and wow, we don't know. We haven't seen how things have unfolded on the ground. So, gosh, I don't know. Maybe that's possible if the world, whatever. But coming now more than 2.5 years later, when literally his Eastern Front is collapsing almost, by the kilometer now on the Eastern Front by the day, and they don't have anybody left in the kitty to put back into this. What sense does it make to even have an aspiration to, quote, force Russia to capitulate when they're on the ascendance?
I think this man makes P.T. Barnum look like a very modest person. He's a huckster. This is entirely nonsense. There's no chance for anything to happen along the lines that he's outlining. But he is really talking to the West. He's talking to the publics, the electorates, and he's saying once again what the people that have put him into power and have kept him there want him to say. It's not going to change anything, but it doesn't make any difference because there is no truth in the mainstream media. By the way, Congressman Thomas Massie has been trying desperately to induce the government to provide hard figures for Ukrainian losses and casualties in both people and equipment. And obviously, he's not getting much in terms of results from the government or from the Department of Defense. This is one enormous lie. And when the lie finally is exposed and this all collapses, it's going to be god-awful in Washington, D.C., and I think across much of Europe, certainly in the NATO states.
If it was just Zelensky, you could almost forgive his delusion, because ultimately, at the end of the day, that's his country and possibly even his personal life that could be at stake here if things continue going their direction. But it's a little bit harder of a challenge when you look at the president of the United States, because it's one thing to have a delusion about your country here, but it's a second thing to have a delusion which could draw your country into a war it's not fighting. Here's what President Biden said at his UN General Assembly speech.
But most importantly, the Ukrainian people stood up. I asked the people of this chamber to stand up for them. The good news is Putin's war has failed, and at his core aim. He set out to destroy Ukraine, but Ukraine is still free. He set out to weaken NATO, but NATO is bigger, stronger, more united than ever before, with 2 new members, Finland and Sweden. But we cannot let up. The world now has another choice to make. Will we sustain our support to help Ukraine win this war and preserve its freedom, or walk away and let aggression be renewed and a nation be destroyed? I know my answer. We cannot grow weary. We cannot look away. And we will not let up on our support for Ukraine, not until Ukraine wins a just and durable peace in the UN Charter.
Wow. I mean, what are you talking about when you say until Ukraine wins a just and endurable victory on the battlefield? There's no prospect for that. So if the U.S., here's what concerns me, Doug. If he's making these kinds of statements clearly divorced from reality, way divorced from reality, might he also make a bad choice when it comes to whether he should or should not authorize long-range weapons from the West to be used by Ukraine, well, really operated by us, against Russian targets deep? I originally thought, no way, he won't do that. Now I'm not so sure.
Well, the underlying assumption of your comment is that he's actually in control of anything. I don't think he is. I don't think he's been in control of much of anything for a long time. There are powerful figures behind him. These are billionaire oligarchs who are dedicated to the destruction of Russia, along with key figures inside his administration, people like Blinken and others. Sullivan is certainly part of that crew, who are maintaining the fiction that something good is happening and that they're winning. There's no such animal. It's complete and utter nonsense. I think the greater danger at this stage is that the Russian leadership in Moscow decides that we are not any longer governed by a legitimate political figure, that in fact we've been taken over by wealthy, powerful figures in the background, and therefore they can't assume anything positive about us any longer. In other words, they look at us and they say it's not enough to say that the Americans have lost their minds and are crazy and are willing to put the entire world at risk in the event of a nuclear exchange. They're now beginning to wonder whether or not they shouldn't get ready quickly for a major global conflict that will involve China and others that are siding with them against us. This is very, very disturbing. I listened earlier today to something that General retired Jack Keane had to say. And of course, he was a strident advocate for war with Russia. Make no bones about it. The Russians are bluffing. The Russians aren't serious. We can push them in any direction we want them to go. It's very dangerous. It's very wrong. And we're courting Armageddon by making these statements.
And on top of that, Doug, this is from back in April, what I'm about to show you here from Biden. But this shows the mentality. And if this was just Biden, you maybe could say, well, again, that's just for show. But this, you can even see hints of this in the Keene soundbite that you're talking about there. Watch this from the president.
We don't walk away from our allies. We stand with them. We don't let tyrants win. We oppose them. We don't merely watch global events unfold. We shape them. That's what it means to be the indispensable nation. That's what it means to be the world's superpower and the world's leading democracy.
I mean, we're not shaping anything. I mean, I could go down a whole long list of things, especially in the Middle East right now, where we're completely feckless in having any influence even on our ally, Israel, much less anything with any of the other parties there. And that thing is just on fire. But you're right here. The one that we're talking about here could go to nuclear war, and that is much more concerning.
Well, that will certainly be a sobering moment for Americans who are listening to this nonsense. It is not improbable or impossible that we could wake up to something that terrible, because there is increasingly a perception of us that we are divorced from reality, that we are exerting no control over ourselves, let alone anybody else. And that worries people. You know, one of the things that worked very well for us during the Cold War was the perception that our government was stable. It was in the hands of stable people, and that they were reachable by phone or in any other capacity quickly in the event of any crisis or conflict. Right now, I think the Russians have concluded that they could ring the phone off the hook and there's nobody at home in Washington, because they've been presented with this fait accompli over and over and over again now for over 2.5 years. By the way, let us remind you, Moscow, that you're defeated, and you must abase yourself. You must bend the knee to us, or we will continue to destroy you. Well, that's absurd. It makes no sense, but it leads people to believe that we have indeed lost our minds. And I think that's where we are right now in the world. A lot of people think that we've lost control of ourselves.
Now, I'm especially on this channel, I don't take a lot of political sides on anything much here, but I'm going to show you something that Trump said yesterday. And I'm not a huge Trump fan in some areas, because he showed during the time he was in office that 3 times he said he was going to withdraw from Syria, and 3 times he allowed the system itself to talk him out of it, and he didn't end up doing it, et cetera. But nevertheless, in contrast to what you just heard from President Biden, here's what Trump said about this war.
Biden and Kamala got us into this war in Ukraine, and now they can't get us out. They can't get us out. I watched him. We will win. We will. He's been saying that for 3 years. But we're stuck in that war unless I'm president. I'll get it done. I'll get it negotiated. I'll get out. We got to get out. Biden says, we will not leave until we win. What happens if they win? That's what they do, is they fight wars. As somebody told me the other day, they beat Hitler, they beat Napoleon. That's what they do, they fight.
Now, and unless he brings in, like, you as Secretary of Defense, which I would advocate for, by the way, if should he win, at least he would be pushing in that direction, something that has some reasonable sanity and logic about it.
No, I think so. And I think his intentions are well meant. We'll have to see. I go back to Eisenhower during his election campaign when he ran for president the first time. And he said not that he would end the war in Korea. He said to everyone, I will go to Korea. I will look at it. I will evaluate it and take appropriate action. That's what he said. He didn't promise to do anything other than what I just outlined. Now, the thing to keep in mind about Eisenhower is that he did go to Korea. He did evaluate the situation, and he concluded that we had no interest that justified intervention in China, which was ultimately the next step that was being advocated by the American military leadership. In fact, Mark Clark was the commander at the time, and he said, I need 880,000 men. And Eisenhower said, to do what? He said, to cross the Yalu and move into China. Well, there was no support in the United States for that. He knew that, and he simply said, no, that's it. We're going to stabilize the situation and end this war as soon as possible. Well, it took another 1.5 to 2 years, but ultimately we got out of it, and we've had relative calm and peace ever since. I would argue we need to get out of Korea too at this point. We've been there far too long. But having said all of that, we're dealing with people that are accustomed to hyperventilating. We have people that speak in terms that are unrealistic all the time. It's almost as though we want to convince ourselves that we are king of the world and that we can shape the world as we see fit. And it can't be done. And we don't want to do it. I would rather that he simply say, we have no strategic interest in eastern Ukraine that justifies this war and supporting the government that is in Kiev. Simply tell the truth. They're corrupt, they're incompetent, and this war is lost. We need to cut our losses and get out. That would be best. But, all the rest of it is unnecessary.
Now, talking about unnecessary, it's one thing you give a UN General Assembly speech, because like probably 90% of the speeches that come out of there, they're aspirational things. They're made for their own domestic audience anyway. It's not anything realistic. Okay, so Biden maybe fell in that category. But now, according to reports, he's about to authorize the next tranche of weapons for Ukraine, a $375 million aid package that's going to include medium-range cluster bombs, which some of which are going to be fitted to go on the F-16s they have, which now they're reportedly are only 4 still airworthy. But still, now then they can fire more weapons in. Now, that's not long range, at least not yet. That meeting doesn't come until Thursday, but it is apparently medium range. Do you see this possibly escalating further, or any risk of crossing a Russian red line?
Well, first of all, the Russians have never established any red lines. We're the ones that established red lines. And then we've proceeded to cross all of them. Remember that Biden just a couple of years ago said F-16s are off the table. That would lead us to a confrontation that would result in global war. I mean, he sounded infinitely more reasonable 2 years ago than he does today. So he's just reading from the script. I think it's very dangerous. And the thing that we need to keep in mind is, for what purpose are we engaging in this brinksmanship? What do we get from this? What interest do the American people have in Eastern Ukraine, let alone the destruction of Russia? I mean, this is a problem. We seem to be dealing with Stalinist personalities for whom the world is black and white, and the only victory is complete subjugation and destruction of its enemy. I mean, this is outrageous nonsense. That was Stalin's goal with Germany. We enabled it. Lend-Lease made it work, and he got away with it. We're not in that game. We're not in that business. We don't have any interest in destroying anyone. We're not in the business of mass murder. We're not in the business of mass destruction. So why do we talk in these terms? It makes absolutely no sense to me. The sad part is that I just don't think most Americans are listening. I think they've tuned it out. And that's what worries me most, because at some point they're in for a very rude awakening. And that's
Right.
what worries me more than anything else, because the Russians are taking all this very seriously. And in contrast to Americans who are paying no attention, the Russians are paying all the attention in the world.
Well,
and they're curious.
Towards that end, there's going to be a report out just this morning that Putin is chairing a meeting today of his national security cabinet. And according to this is, I guess, one of the things they're going to talk about. And this is one day ahead of the Biden-Zelensky meeting about whether or not we're going to authorize long-range weapons. You see that Peskov has said there that if they believe that the U.S. can give these long-range weapons, there'd be no consequence. He said that is a fatal mistake. And we'll see what comes out of this meeting, how much ever they talk about it here before. But I want to zero in on something you just said here, because I think it's really important, and people are about to see why. You said that we established a lot of these red lines that we then crossed. Now, this issue with the long range may be one of the first, something close to a red line that the Russians have established. But because all these other self-imposed red lines were crossed and nothing happened, at least relatively speaking, there's this belief in the United States and in the West generally that there are no red lines, that that Russia will never do anything because they, quote, know that our reaction would be too strong for them. They couldn't handle it. Here was, I believe, just yesterday, or maybe even today, it was your old friend David Petraeus saying the same thing. Watch this.
At the end of the day, we have heard his threats since the very beginning of the war, sometimes including threats of use of tactical nuclear weapons, and they have proved empty again and again and again. They're hollow. And he establishes red lines. Ukraine has crossed every red line. And again, he's doing everything he can to destroy Ukraine, to deny its right to exist, and to eliminate it as an independent country. He's not holding anything back.
I'm sorry, that was actually the 16th of September. It wasn't yesterday, but the mentality is still the same here, is that all these red lines are crossed. So yeah, don't even worry about it here. But I want to focus separately on the second part of what he said, that he described what Putin's objectives are: to destroy Ukraine. How do you see those two things?
Well, first of all, we are the ones who are responsible for the destruction of Ukraine. Without us, without our open-ended funding, the steady stream of equipment and weapon systems, I don't think this war would have lasted a month and a half. So we're the ones that have sustained the war and kept it going. Secondly, Putin has never had any objective other than to remove the threat to Russia that was metastasizing on his border in eastern Ukraine. He wasn't simply worried about the so-called Ukrainian army, which we poured a lot of money and assets into. He was worried about the inevitable arrival of missiles that could then be used to disrupt and destroy his nuclear deterrent. From eastern Ukraine to reach the missiles that Russia deems vital and essential to their national deterrent is a matter of minutes. He wasn't going to tolerate that. From Russia's standpoint, the entire purpose of the operation from the very beginning was to remove the threat. They certainly don't want to govern Ukraine. They'd much prefer the Ukrainians govern themselves, but they don't want it to become a permanent base for NATO and attack against them. Listen, there's a larger issue here. There are 600,000 dead Ukrainian soldiers now. That's a rough number, but it could be more, but it's certainly not less. This is our fault. We've done this to the people of Ukraine. How many people remain in Ukraine? I don't really know. Maybe 15, 16, 17 million, 18 million. Millions have left. The country is ruined because of us and our intervention, not anything Russia has done. Until recently, Russia has exercised enormous restraint. When he says Russia's not holding anything back, he's dead wrong. He couldn't be more wrong. Remember, this is the same man who advertised repeatedly every time there was a Ukrainian offensive. I'm very confident that the Ukrainians have mastered combined arms warfare, and we're going to see evidence for this, and there will be victory. You know, it's all nonsense. It's all crap. He doesn't know what he's talking about. And combined arms is a World War II concept. That's not what you're seeing in Ukraine now anyway.
Yeah.
The bottom line is that none of these people have any credibility. No one should listen to anything they say. And as far as Russia is concerned, simply because Russia has not yet committed to the use of a nuclear weapon doesn't mean they can't. And he also is stating something else that's fundamentally false. Putin has never threatened to use a nuclear weapon. He has said repeatedly, we've got them, and if we're pushed to do so, we'll use them. But he's made it very clear that they would not be the first to do so. Now, they've watched carefully the statements that have come out of Biden's mouth, where Biden talked about, no, we're not going to sign up for no first use. We're reconsidering our use of nuclear weapons in the future. The Russians are very concerned about that. So they've moved weapons forward. They are positioned to strike with so-called tactical nuclear weapons if they need to. But the notion that somehow or another the Russians haven't held back is just absurd. If anything, they've held back tremendously because, again, they have no interest in murdering large numbers of Ukrainian Slavs. We're the ones that put the biolabs into Ukraine. And we're the ones that oversaw and supervised experimentation in these labs designed for biological warfare. People are claiming that they were looking at ways to kill Slavs. Now, that's insane based on DNA. I have no way of knowing whether or not any of it is true, but that sort of thing has reached Russia. I mean, this is you cannot engage in these activities, put all these biolabs on the ground, put all the weaponry that is there, make the statements you have about Russia, and then expect the Russians to sit there, take it, and accept it, and do nothing. So
along those
pushing, we're going to get that. We're going to cross that red line at some point. And everybody's going to say, "Gosh, how did this happen?"
Along those lines, there was something that Zelensky said, and I don't have this clip available at the moment, in his UN Security Council speech that he made yesterday, where he said that one of the reasons why he wanted all this help from the world is because he has proof that Russia is getting ready to strike 3 nuclear power stations in Ukraine. Now, this, I can't imagine just on the surface of it why anyone who's winning a war would ever do that in the territory that they hope to actually occupy, or at least to have their people live in. But I just wonder what your view is on
Well,
that.
Dan, we have experience with the Russians taking over a nuclear power station in Ukraine. The Ukrainians were trying to damage it. They were trying to cause an accident that would contaminate the area around the plant and potentially other areas of Ukraine. The Russians went in there. They set up extensive protection measures. They brought in the International Atomic Agency inspectors. Everyone came in there and said the Russians are doing everything they possibly can to ensure that nothing is damaged, that there are no accidents, that the place is not being attacked. It was the Ukrainians who were trying to do the damage. So all of these are just lies upon more lies. And I don't know what to tell the American people. They should be smarter by now. They should look at the map, look at the truth, look what's happening on the ground. You've had people like Petraeus and Keene and others tell us that they're winning, but you look at the map and you look at the losses. You can look at the satellite photography that shows the enormous numbers of graves, the hospitals that have been filled to capacity, the numbers of dead that are being transported. Who are we kidding? This is a big lie. It needs to stop. On humanitarian grounds, it should stop immediately, because if we want anything of Ukraine to survive, now's the time to stop it. And we're making it impossible for Ukraine to ever recover. And I guess we're thinking that perhaps without people, BlackRock and friends can come in there and take it over, and they'll be happier with a place that has no people in it. I don't know. But the whole thing is insane. This needs to stop. Donald Trump is right. And he's saying, if you elect me, I will stop it. Well, God bless him. I hope he does, because my concern is that he'll get in there and a lot of people that surround him with bad intentions will try to dissuade him from ending this. We just need to end it and get out.
Now, one of my concerns is that why would Zelensky make that claim so emphatically in that Security Council brief? If it was just completely made up, there's no value in it. What I worry about is, and I would like your view on the possibility of this, or probability, that Ukraine may do a false flag operation where they themselves strike one of their own facilities that they possess and claim, see, I warned you about this. It was Russia was going to do it, and now it happened. What is the chance of that?
Dan, you're asking me to provide you with an assessment that I can't, because I'm not part of the intelligence community. I wouldn't put anything past anyone these days. Look, we went through this in Syria. If you go back during President Trump's first term, we had 2 series of missile strikes. And the argument was that chemical weapons had been employed by Syria. Well, that was just nonsense. It was completely untrue. It appears in retrospect that MI6 in London had a lot to do with that. I don't know. I mean, you bring on Ted Postal. He can tell you more about it than I can. I just don't know. But my point is, I'm sure that there are potentialities that would support false flags. They've always been there. They are there now. And what we should have learned by now from the people that are ruling us in Washington, D.C. and ruling London is that they will do anything, number one, to stay in power. And number two, that they will say anything to justify their actions. Truth is dead. I remember this statement from Boris Pasternak's novel, Dr. Zhivago, and it was made by a Communist Party member. Said the private life in Russia is dead. Well, I'm beginning to think the truth inside the United States is dead. That's the problem. The media is conspiring to lie and mislead people. The government is. There is no truth out there except what you dig to find on your own. That's a dangerous position for a republic to be in.
And let me just kind of caveat off that, or jump on top of that, why it's so dangerous. If this is just kind of a 1984-ish doublespeak where we say whatever we want, and it's just, that's as far as it goes, that's one thing. But when there are potential serious ramifications and consequences to such deception and lying, it's a separate issue. We're taking a chance that Putin doesn't mean what he says, and we may end up allowing long-range weapons to be used, or even any other kind of escalation. And then we could potentially become in the crosshairs ourselves and get drawn into this war. But there is this really mistaken belief by many in the West that we have the world's greatest military in the history of the world, as Biden has said on so many occasions. And yet this little known, a couple of things I want to show here that most people don't pay attention to. Not long ago, there was an article that said 17 ships of the United States Navy are getting mothballed. Not because they're bad ships, not because that there's something wrong with them, but because we didn't have enough crew members to operate them. So we had to shut down 7 vehicles because we already didn't have enough sailors even to operate what is claimed to be the insufficient number of sailors that we have. Then Sullivan admitted something about a week or so ago in Kiev. I don't think he intended, but I thought it was very alarming, where he admitted our interceptor missiles are really, really in short supply. Watch this.
Ukraine was running short of air defense interceptors. So I sat down with my team and I said, where are we sending Patriot missiles and AMRAAM missiles around the world in the next 12 months? And I was told there's a whole list of countries we're sending them to. And I said, take every single one of those missiles, every one, and send them to Ukraine. That was not an easy thing to do. It required us to get our allies and partners to come along. Frankly, it required our bureaucracy to come along. And we are currently working on a substantial package, pulling together a range of different capabilities that we are going to try to get out the door before the end of this month.
So interceptor missiles and AMRAAM, that's air missiles that go on our airframes. He just said that we are so strapped everywhere that he took all of them that we're supposed to send elsewhere around the world to go to Ukraine. Now, what happens if we don't even have enough sailors to operate the Navy? We don't have enough air defense systems. By the way, 5% on the NATO eastern flank for ourselves. If we get sucked into a war because of all this mendacity, Doug, what is going to happen to our military?
Anyone with experience in the defense industry, I'm talking about people that are involved in more than, say, business development. You know, the notion that buy this, here's a shiny brochure, we build the best missile, best radar, whatever. People that actually know something about the defense industries will tell you we have no surge capacity. In other words, there is no capacity for the United States government today to turn to Raytheon or Lockheed Martin or anybody else and say, we want you to increase the production of Standard missiles or Patriot missiles or THAAD missiles or any other missile by tenfold. And we want all of this to happen within the next 30 days. Well, you can express that wish, but it's not going to happen. We don't have the capacity to do that. And this was well known before this began. Also keep something else in mind. Habitually, you tend to shoot at least 3 missiles at every incoming missile. Now, that means that there's an exchange of 3 to 1, assuming that you hit the incoming missile at all. You can't win that fight. You're going to run out of missiles to defend yourself long before your opponent runs out of missiles to strike you with. Frankly, we're seeing that happen right now on the ground in Israel. 400 missiles a day easily exhausts Iron Dome and all the other systems. And they haven't even touched the portion of the arsenal that is by far the most destructive. So it's tragic that the man had to say those things in public. I would not have wanted to admit something like that had I been in his position. I think it was ill-advised. But for a change, he told you the truth. So God bless him for that. He's telling you the truth. We can't sustain this. We can't keep it up. We're not prepared for a major war, period. Logistically, in terms of infrastructure. And you keep talking about the other most important part, which everyone ignores, and that is human capital. It's not just bodies that you put into spaces and fill them. You've got to have intelligent people that are trained and competent and capable and who are well led and will fight effectively. We're lacking in those departments right now, very seriously, as you point out.
So then which should be not just an important thing to do, but paramount importance to get this war off the table, to get the Middle East war off the table. Because the other portion of this, if we should get drawn into a war with Russia, because Russia's now had a 2.5-year head start, and they did it took them about a year and a half, to your point there, to retool all of their defense industrial base so that it could be cranking in 24/7. They accelerated what they could, but it took a year and a half to build the capacity to do that, and a year and a half to get the manpower drafted and then trained. And they've been working on that too. If we get into a war, we are absolutely flat-footed.
Yes.
And if anything happens in the Indo-Pacific, and God help us if it ever is joint, China, on the other hand, has foreseen this, and they do have a bigger standard industrial capacity, and they could surge things that we could not fight a war in either one of these places, I don't think, Doug, and
No.
even survive, much less prevail.
Well, listen, we're an island. Fortunately, we have the Atlantic and the Pacific on either side, and we're largely isolated from many things, but we are not in a position to fight a major war against anyone right now. We shouldn't even think about it. First of all, it's not necessary. The people out there are not looking for a fight with us. This is the sad part. We're the ones that seem to be intent on this. Sometimes I wonder about the people in charge, because they convey the impression that this is their last chance, that they have to pull out all the stops now in order to vanquish all of their potential enemies, both at home and abroad. In other words, we've got to destroy everyone who is opposed to us, whether it's Russia, China, Iran, Hezbollah, Houthis, Shiite militias in Iraq, whatever, the whole Islamic world, if you will, on one hand, Russia, its friends, its supporters, its allies. And at the same time, we've got to destroy those evil white Christians who happen to be nationalists inside our borders. And no stone can be left unturned. In other words, let's do it. Let's get it all done at once. Let's pass the laws, the legislation. Let's mobilize the police. Let's suppress all of this. It's insane. It doesn't make any sense. It's irrational. It's counterproductive. It's stupid. That's where we are.
But
How do we stop it? We want to go to the ballot box and vote. I hope that works. A lot of Americans justifiably have real questions about the validity of the ballot box.
Right. But let's look for a second at the I guess the proximal problem here, and that is the people, the elites or so, that are in charge of some of these decisions. Now, I can get it that they want to stay in power, that they want to do all these things to all these enemies. I mean, aspirational again, but they have the ability to, and the full knowledge of all these things we just mentioned here about the insufficient manpower pool, definitely the insufficient weapon capabilities and defense industrial base. It seems like in their own self-interest that they would say, all right, let's avoid going down this path because we can't do it. Or even at the alternative is to say, all right, if we're going to do that, we need to crank this stuff up fast. So let's spend the next 2 years advancing our industrial capacity, et cetera. I think that would be a terrible thing to do, but at least rationally, if you want to do these bad things, you have to have the capacity. Right now, we don't have the capacity, but it looks like we're still toying with the edges of maybe starting it anyway. How do you see that?
Well, I think we misperceive reality in Washington. Washington thinks it has more capability than it does. Washington is stuck in a time warp. We've discussed this before. They think it's 1991. Their view of the world is this world that emerges in the early 1990s, where we were effectively alone in the world as the great superpower. They don't seem to understand that over the last 30 years, the world has moved on. It's developed. It's expanded. We are no longer the lone ranger out there that can do anything, anywhere, anytime he wants. So I think that's part of the problem. And, this is this kind of national narcissism that is very, very dangerous. Every great power at some point or another in its history has succumbed to this. I'm afraid we're reaching the point now where it's almost terminal, and we've got to get out of it. We've got to get away from it. We have to see ourselves in more realistic terms. And that doesn't mean that there's something bad or wrong with us. On the contrary, I don't think there is, although the people that are governing us in Washington seem to think there is. I just think, frankly speaking, rationality is no longer guiding any thinking or behavior. It's fantasy world on steroids. It's fantasy island. A friend of mine likes to call Washington Versailles on the Potomac. That sounds good, but I think fantasy island is a better description. because
Yeah,
there is no sense of reality anymore. No
it-
sense of limitations. None.
yeah, and certainly neither one of those epithets
And
are
the
good.
one thing that's worth keeping in mind is that in contrast to us, President Putin and the Russians have always been acutely sensitive to their limitations, and they've acted accordingly. And you've talked about that. You just explained it. They recognized that they had limited capability, and they decided to do what? Move to the strategic defensive and build it up. Well, they've done that,
Yeah.
and they've won their war for all intents and purposes. What they'd like to do now is end it through negotiation, but we're not really interested in doing that. So I think the predisposition in Moscow is to try and wait for the outcome of this election and see whether or not what President Trump wants to do can be delivered. And I think if President Trump has his way and sticks with his position, he can deliver an end to the conflict in Ukraine. That, of course, does nothing for us at all in the Middle East. And the Middle East, again, is no longer confined to the Middle East. If Iran is drawn into this, which I think is almost inevitable, Russia and China are going to stand with Iran. They're not going to allow Iran to be pulverized into submission. So you're back to where you started. It's not a very favorable position to be in. The world doesn't need this war, doesn't need any war.
No, certainly not. And in the last few minutes we have here, I want to jump real quick because we talked a little bit about the Middle East and certainly a lot about the Russia-Ukraine situation. But I was on Fox News earlier today and was asked about some comments about the Indo-Pacific and specifically about China testing this new long-range ICBM into the deep into the Pacific Ocean, et cetera, and what message were they trying to send? And some of the congressmen that they quoted were saying that we need to significantly ramp up our Indo-Pacific defenses, et cetera. This is all in the context of just within a week or so, there was this huge joint naval exercise between Russia and China in the Sea of Japan of over 400 vessels of various types and 90,000 personnel. What do you make of what China is doing and what we should be concerned about?
How many Chinese bases exist in the Western Hemisphere? How many Chinese naval flotillas are routinely off the coast of California and Massachusetts and in the Caribbean Ocean? How frequently do the Russian and Chinese fleets operate there together? Look, China is not interested in going to war with anybody. They're about business. The Chinese are the best capitalists the world has ever seen. Every time I hear some fool on the Hill talk about the Communist Party of China or the Chinese Communists, they're out of their minds. Forget it. These people are shameless capitalists. They're better at it than we are. So these people are not communists. They're not interested in going to war with anybody for any reason. It's bad for business. We need to do less, not more. We need to demilitarize our relations with Asia. Asia doesn't want a war. All of the states that are involved in the South China Sea are quite capable and quite willing to deal with the Chinese. The Chinese have established hotlines now all the way to Vietnam. They don't want a war with Vietnam. The Vietnamese have militarized more islands in the South China Sea than the Chinese have. They have permanent disputes. Taiwan's views of things are indistinguishable from China's. In other words, we act like Taiwan is a victim. Are you kidding? Taiwan wants to control everything in the South China Sea the same way as Beijing. Why are we involved with this? Why are we supporting it? Doesn't make any sense. The only thing we should be concerned about in Asia is whether or not commerce continues without interruption. That's it. That's what freedom of the seas is really all about. The Chinese aren't stopping commercial vessels. They never have. They can't afford to. They live and die on the basis of maritime commerce. They're not going to block the Straits of Malacca. They're not going to block the Straits of Hormuz. All of this is about business. And we need to get out of this constant predisposition to militarize everything because it's not about military conflict. Certainly not in Asia. And there will be no war in Asia unless we start it. And again, when you go back to Taiwan, there are no massive Chinese armies building up and preparing to launch amphibious operations against Taiwan. The only way you get into a war with China over Taiwan is if we try to do to Taiwan what the Soviets did to Cuba. Put missiles there and directly threaten China. If we're stupid and we do that, yes, you will get a war with China. Otherwise, forget it. No, It's not going to happen.
So
So,
if I
but
can
this
sum
is
up,
unpopular inside the Beltway. I mean, how do you justify spending $1 trillion a year on defense if you admit that there is no real justification for it?
well, and then the other perversion part of that is that we spend $1 trillion on defense and we don't even have the capacity to fight one of these wars, let alone three, because you've just laid out here that there doesn't need to be any war in Europe, that the Russia-Ukraine war can and should be resolved immediately. Something very, very quickly could be done. That the war in the Middle East, if we used our leverage against Israel, could also be brought to a pretty quick conclusion, and there shouldn't be any conflict at all in the Indo-Pacific. And yet all three of those are seriously possible because of our actions.
Yeah, it's true. And there's no evidence that Washington is prepared to do anything that makes sense. In fact, as you heard in Biden's speech, the predisposition is to cultivate more hostility, more warfare, more destruction. That seems to be the agenda item for Washington, D.C. And people say to me, well, how can you say that about the United States? Look, I'm not talking about the United States of America. I'm not talking about Americans. Americans aren't consulted on these things, Dan. When's the last time we were asked to vote on anything that made any difference to our lives? All of these decisions, whether it's to open the borders, fight in the Middle East, fight in Eastern Europe, fight in Asia, all of these decisions are taken out of our hands. We have no influence at all because Congress is in the hands of big donors. They purchased policymaking. They make the policies. We happen to be bystanders at our own demise, to be blunt.
And so, I mean, you're trying to do the best you can. You're trying to do something more than just come out on shows like this, which we certainly appreciate. But with Our Country, Our Choice, is there anything on the horizon that can maybe whittle away at some of that power?
Well, as we've talked before, what is happening now that I think is very important is the emergence of this free speech platform called Republic. And it takes the position that all politics, as Tip O'Neill once said, really are local. And that if you want to influence things and you want to change things, you've got to get control of the political life in your own community. If you don't like what the sheriff is or is not doing, if you don't like what the mayor is or is not doing, if you don't like your representatives, you're going to win or lose on the basis of what you decide and how you vote and how you behave in your community. And so Republic is a platform that you can go to, you can get on it, and you can begin to have an impact. You can take action. You can contact people in power. You can send them things. You can mobilize others in your community. You know, one of the things that distinguished us as a nation from so many others is self-organization. You know, de Tocqueville, when he was writing about America in the 1840s, he said, everywhere there's industry, everywhere there's development, and nowhere is there administration. In other words, he saw no government. Everything was happening on its own. And he made the comment that if you wanted to build a bridge and improve a road, it would take a year to work its way through the bureaucracy in Paris. And then you might not even get it. He said, here in the United States, when the community decides it needs a bridge, they build it. We've got to get back to that.
Yeah.
And that's what Republic is really all about. It's about regaining control of our lives. And you can't be censored and you can't be thrown off because there is no advertising. When I say no advertising, I'm talking about no corporate advertising. Small businesses are free to come on and advertise all they like, but we don't want this platform to be hostage to big money, because then somebody comes on, and you've listened to Elon Musk talk about this, and he's hated and despised by people because he said, well, I don't give a damn what you think. I'm going to say this, and I have the right to say it. Well, that's Republic. That is Republic. You can come on and say, unless you're pornographic or you are threatening to overthrow the government, those are two things that we will not tolerate on that platform. You can come on and say and do whatever you like, and you can organize yourselves at every level to have an impact. And that's really what has to happen, self-organization. Americans got to get out of this business of waiting around for somebody to save them. We have to save ourselves.
Yeah, because the system is I hate to use the term rigged just because it has negative connotations, but it is designed to prevent anyone in the system from rising up to it, because of these powerful elite know how to suppress and push anybody down that would have the capacity to provide that leadership. And hence we have what we have, which is why platforms like Republic is certainly something that's good. I recommend people go to your site there, ourcountry.ourchoice.com, and and take a look at the things you got there. And we'll probably be talking about Republic here on our channel here coming up pretty soon, I believe.
I would hope so, because there's a way. The price of going on for a year right now is $180, but you, I, and others have discount codes, and you can get on that platform for $120, which is, I think, a very small price to pay for the potentiality of the program. But anyway, I'm sure you'll put that in your notes for the program, and people can find those things.
Yeah.
And don't despair. As bad as it looks, there is no reason to despair. More and more and more Americans are beginning to figure out that they are simply not represented. Their interests are not taken seriously. And that's the first step in the direction of regaining our liberty and control of our own government.
Yeah, I do agree that it's even though the circumstances are pretty unpleasant at the moment and frightful, there is at least a possibility, as long as we do what we can within our own abilities. And that's why we love to have you on our show. So thanks a lot for coming on again today, Doug. Really appreciate it.
Sure. Thanks, Dan.
And we appreciate you guys too. Again, be sure and like and subscribe if you haven't already to our channel. It really helps out in ways. It helps us to expand it. The more people that like this, the more YouTube uses that to send it to other people. So if you want to help us spread the word for that, be sure and like and subscribe. We will look forward to seeing you soon on the next episode of Daniel Davis Deep Dive, and we appreciate you guys.